Wyoming Territory, 1,878 Blackwood Ranch, beneath a blood-red sunset choked with dust. Heat the iron. Let every man in the West know she belongs to me, Jeremiah Blackwood roared, as the glowing brand moved toward Evie Thorne's bare shoulder. Surrounded by 40 laughing men, Evie refused to scream. She raised her chin, her terrified eyes locking onto Gideon Hayes. Then Gideon drew his revolver. "Cut her loose," he growled, his expression turning deadly. "She doesn't belong to anyone." One gunshot shattered the night and turned a ruthless bounty hunter into the only man standing between Evie and all of Blackwood Ranch. Now let's begin this unforgettable Western tale of courage, justice, and forbidden love. Stay with us until the very end. Gideon Hayes had seen men die for less than $1. He'd never seen anything like this. The Blackwood Ranch sat under a bruised evening sky, dust hanging thick in the torchlight. 40 men, maybe more, formed a rough circle around the corral. Cattle hands, hired guns, a few drunk enough to be laughing. In the middle of that circle knelt a woman with her wrists bound and her dress torn at the shoulder. Evie Thorne. Gideon had ridden 3 weeks to find her. Jeremiah Blackwood paid good money for that kind of work, and Gideon had never asked too many questions about where the money came from. A runaway was a runaway. Bring her back. Collect the fee. Right on to the next job. That was the plan, anyway. A forge glowed near the fence post, coals breathing orange in the dark. A man Gideon didn't know pulled an iron rod from the fire. The tip was shaped like a letter, maybe curled and cruel, hot enough to hiss when it touched the air. "Hold her still," Jeremiah said. He stood off to the side, arms folded, watching like a man inspecting cattle he already owned. Gideon's jaw tightened. He told himself it wasn't his business. He'd done worse and slept fine. But something about the way this woman knelt in the dirt kept snagging at him, and he couldn't say why. Not yet. The men grabbed her arms. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She lifted her chin. Her eyes found Gideon's across the circle, and for one long second, the noise of the crowd fell away. There was no fear in her stare, just a kind of stillness, hard and clear, like something that refused to break, no matter how close the fire came. Gideon had seen that look before, years ago, in a shack outside Abilene. His own mother had worn it right before a man twice her size put his boot on her neck and told her who she belonged to. She'd looked at 9-year-old Gideon the same way, not asking for rescue, just making sure he'd remember. He never forgot. The iron came closer to Evie's bare shoulder, close enough that she flinched from the heat, though she never dropped her chin. Something in Gideon's chest turned over, slow and final, like a door swinging shut on the man he used to be. He drew his revolver before he'd fully decided to. The shot cracked across the yard, and the forge burst apart in a shower of sparks and hot iron. Coals scattered across the dirt. Men shouted and scrambled back. The brand itself, still glowing, spun off into the dark somewhere past the fence. For a moment, nobody moved. 40 men stared at Gideon like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. Jeremiah's face went the color of old meat. "Hayes." "What in the hell?" Gideon turned the barrel on him before he finished the sentence. "Cut her loose," Gideon said. Nobody moved. He cocked the hammer. The sound was small, but out here, in that silence, it might as well have been a church bell. I said, "Cut her loose." A ranch hand near Evie fumbled for his knife and sawed through the rope at her wrists, hand shaking so bad it took him 3 tries. Evie rubbed her wrists once, slow, like she didn't quite believe they were free. "You have any idea what you're doing?" Jeremiah said, his voice pitched somewhere between fury and disbelief. "You work for me." "Not anymore. She's mine. Bought and paid for. There's a contract." "There ain't a contract in the world that makes a person property," Gideon said. Should have figured that out a long time ago. He kept his gun leveled at Jeremiah while he reached down with his free hand and pulled Evie to her feet. She stumbled, weak from days without decent food. But she didn't lean on him. She stood on her own, breathing hard, staring at the men around her like she was daring one of them to try something. Nobody did. 40 men. and not one of them wanted to be the first to test a gunslinger with nothing left to lose. Gideon backed toward the horses, pulling Evie along, his revolver never wavering from Jeremiah's chest. When they reached his mare, he swung up first and hauled Evie behind him. "You're a dead man." "Hayes," Jeremiah called after them, finally finding his voice again, now that there was distance between them. "You hear me?" Dead Gideon didn't answer. He dug his heels into the mare's sides, and they tore off into the dark, the shouts of the ranch fading behind them, swallowed up by wind and hoofbeats. They rode for hours. Evie said nothing, just held on, her arms locked around his waist, her body rigid-like. She still expected the whole thing to be some kind of cruel trick. Gideon couldn't blame her. In her position, he wouldn't have trusted anybody either. When the horse finally slowed, they were miles from Blackwood land, deep in a stretch of scrub and rock where the stars hung low and close. Gideon reined in near a dry creek bed and helped her down. She stepped back from him immediately, putting distance between them, watching him with the same wariness she'd shown every man since the ranch. "Why'd you do that?" she asked. Her voice was rough from disuse, but steady. Gideon didn't have a clean answer. He looked at his hands instead, the same hands that had pulled the trigger 100 times for 100 different reasons, none of them as good as this one. "Didn't like what I was looking at," he said finally. That's it. That's it." She studied him a long moment, arms crossed over her chest like she was still holding herself together. "You work for men like Jeremiah. You track down women like me for a living. Used to. And now." Gideon looked off toward the horizon, where the first hint of dawn was starting to gray the edge of the sky. "Now I reckon I don't." Evie didn't answer that. She wrapped her arms tighter around herself and turned to look back the way they'd come, toward the ranch that still owned every scrap of paper, claiming to own her. Gideon watched her in the half-light. He thought about his mother again, about the boot on her neck, about how nobody had come for her in time. He'd come too late once already in his life. He wasn't planning on making that mistake twice. "There's a town a day's ride from here," he said. "Purgatory. Rough place, but nobody there's going to ask questions about who you are or where you came from." Evie turned back to him, studying his face, like she was trying to decide if he meant it. "And after that," she asked, "what happens to me then?" Gideon swung back up onto his horse and held a hand down for her. "After that," he said, "that's up to you. Nobody else." She looked at his hand for a long moment before she finally took it. Purgatory earned its name, honestly. It sat at the bottom of a dry valley, ringed by hills stripped bare from years of mining. The buildings thrown up quick and cheap out of whatever lumber the boomtown could scavenge. Smoke hung over the rooftops day and night. Men shouted in a dozen languages outside the saloons. It was loud and dirty and lawless in the particular way that mining towns were lawless, where the only rule anyone respected was, don't get caught. It was exactly the kind of place where two people could disappear. Evie hadn't said much since they crossed into the valley. She sat behind Gideon on the horse, her hands loose at his waist, now instead of gripping like she expected him to bolt. But her eyes never stopped moving, watching the alleys, watching the men on the boardwalks. Watching him, mostly. Whenever she thought, he wasn't paying attention. He was always paying attention. It was a habit that had kept him alive for 15 years in this line of work. And it wasn't one he could just switch off because the job had changed. They stopped in front of a 2-story building with a faded sign reading Mart A's in peeling white letters. Gideon swung down first and reached up to help Evie off the horse. She ignored his hand and slid down on her own, landing a little unsteady, but upright. "You don't have to keep doing that," he said. "Doing what?" "Refusing help." "I ain't gonna bite." Evie looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize. Flat, careful, the look of someone doing math in her head, weighing every word for what it might cost her later. "Forgive me if I'm not in a hurry to trust a man who was paid to drag me back in chains 3 days ago," she said. Gideon couldn't argue with that. He tied off the horse and led her inside without another word. The boarding house smelled like lye soap and wood smoke. A stout woman with gray, threading through her dark hair, looked up from behind the front counter, took one look at Evie's torn dress and the raw skin at her wrists, and didn't ask a single question. She just came around the counter and put an arm around Evie's shoulders, gentle like she'd done it 100 times before. Room at the top of the stairs, the woman said. Hot water's on the stove. I'll bring up some stew and a clean dress. She glanced at Gideon over Evie's head. You her husband? No, ma'am. Good, the woman said, and didn't explain herself further. Name's Martha. This is my house. Whatever happened before you walked through that door, it stays outside it. Understood. Gideon nodded. Evie said nothing, but something in her shoulders loosened, just slightly, like she'd been braced for a blow that never came. Martha took her upstairs. Gideon found a chair on the porch and sat down to wait, his rifle across his knees, and didn't move from that spot until well past midnight. It became a routine over the following days. Evie stayed in the room Martha had given her, sleeping most of the daylight hours away. The kind of sleep that comes after a body has been running on fear for too long and finally stops. Gideon took a room down the hall and spent his nights on the porch, cleaning his guns by lamplight, listening to the town outside settle into its late, drunken hours. He wasn't sure why he stayed. The job was done. Technically, he'd pulled her out. Nobody was paying him to sit on a porch in purgatory playing guard dog. But every time he thought about riding on, he pictured Jeremiah's men catching up with her in some other town, some place without a Martha to take her in. And he stayed another day. On the fourth morning, Evie came downstairs on her own for the first time. She'd washed and changed into one of Martha's spare dresses, plain gray cotton, that hung a little loose on her frame. Her hair was combed back. She looked steadier than she had, though her eyes still carried that same wariness, like an animal that had been caught in a trap once and never quite forgot the shape of it. She found Gideon out back, checking over his saddle, and stood in the doorway, watching him work for a while before she spoke. I want to ask you something. Gideon looked up. Go ahead. Why haven't you left? Figured you might still need looking after. I don't need a keeper, Evie said, sharp enough that Gideon straightened up. I had one of those already. Didn't much care for it. Gideon set down the saddle strap in his hands. He understood then what she was really asking. Not why are you still here? What do you want from me? He walked over to his horse, dug through the saddlebag, and came back with his revolver. He popped the cylinder open, right there in front of her, and emptied every round into his palm. 6 bullets, cold and heavy. He dropped them into his coat pocket and held the empty gun out to her. Grip first. Evie stared at it like it might be a trick. Go on, he said. Take it. She took it slow, like she still expected the cylinder to be loaded, like she expected this to be some kind of test she was bound to fail. She turned the gun over in her hands, checked the chamber herself, found it empty just like he'd said. It's empty, she said. I know. Then why give it to me? Gideon leaned back against the fence post, arms crossed, watching her hold the gun like it was the first solid thing anyone had put in her hands in a long time. Because I want you to point it at me, he said. Evie's eyes snapped up to his. Go on, right at my chest. See how it feels. She hesitated. Then, slow, she lifted the revolver and leveled it at him. Her hand shook, just a little, but she held it steady enough. Gideon didn't flinch. He stood there and let her look down that empty barrel at him for a long 5 seconds. Feel any different? He asked. Evie's jaw tightened. It's empty. It doesn't mean anything. Sure it does. Means you got a choice in your hand, even if it's a small one. Means you're the one deciding whether to raise it or lower it. Nobody's making that call for you. She lowered the gun slowly, turning it over again, running her thumb along the cold metal like she was trying to memorize the weight of it. That's not the same as being free, she said quietly. No, Gideon admitted. It ain't, but it's a start. Evie looked at him for a long moment, something working behind her eyes that he couldn't quite read. Then she handed the gun back to him. Grip first, the same way he'd offered it. I want you to teach me to shoot it loaded, she said. Not for show, for real. Why? Because the next time somebody points a gun at me, empty or not, I want to know what to do about it. Gideon studied her face. There was no fear in it now, none of the flatness from before. Just a hard, quiet resolve that reminded him, again, of that look she'd given him back at the ranch. Right before the iron nearly touched her skin. "All right," he said, "but not today. Today, you rest. Tomorrow, we start." Evie nodded. And for the first time since he'd pulled her out of that circle of men, something close to a smile crossed her face. Small, tired, but real. "There's one more thing," she said, turning to go back inside. She paused in the doorway, her hand on the frame. "That contract Jeremiah kept talking about, the one that says I belong to him. What about it?" "It's paper," she said. "Just paper. A man wrote words on it and called it law, and everybody around him agreed to pretend those words meant something they never could." Gideon nodded slowly. "That's about the size of it. Then it's not real," Evie said, more to herself than to him. None of it was ever real. "A soul ain't a paper deed some rich bastard can file at a courthouse," Gideon said. "You belong to you. Evelyn always did. Contract never changed that. It just tried to convince you otherwise." Evie stood in that doorway a long while, the morning light falling across her face, and Gideon watched something shift in her, quiet but permanent, like a fence post finally driven deep enough into the ground to hold against the wind. Then she went inside, without another word, and Gideon went back to his saddle, and neither of them spoke of it again that day. But something had changed between them out there by the fence, something neither one was ready to name yet, and it would stay with them long after the gun was loaded and the lessons began in earnest. The days in purgatory settled into a rhythm neither of them planned, but both of them needed. Mornings belonged to the canyon outside town, where Gideon taught Evie to load, aim, and fire. Afternoons belonged to Martha's boarding house, where Evie found herself with a needle and thread in her hands more often than not, mending torn shirts and worn hems for a few extra coins. Evenings belonged to the porch, where Gideon sat with his rifle across his knees and watched the road, and Evie sat a few feet away, close enough to talk if she wanted, far enough to keep her guard up if she didn't. It was on one of those evenings, about 2 weeks in, that Martha came out to join them, a basket of mending under one arm and a tired look on her face that Evie had started to recognize. The look of someone carrying something heavy for a long time and getting used to the weight of it. "You sew well," Martha said, settling into the rocking chair beside Evie. "Where'd you learn?" "My mother," Evie said, before she passed. Martha nodded and picked up a shirt from her own basket, needle already moving through the fabric with the ease of decades of practice. They worked in silence for a while, the only sound the creak of Martha's rocker and the distant noise of the town settling into its evening business. "Can I ask you something?" "Martha," Evie said eventually. "Ask away. How long have you run this place?" 15 years, near enough. And before that, Martha's needle paused, just for a second, before starting up again. "Before that, I worked for a family a good deal, like the one you ran from." Evie set her own sewing down in her lap, the Blackwoods. Martha didn't answer right away. She finished the seam she was working on, bit off the thread, and folded the shirt neat in her lap before she spoke again. "Different family, same kind of arrangement. Bought and sold like livestock. Same as you were. I was younger than you when it happened. Took me the better part of 10 years to save enough, and the right kind of luck, to buy my way clear of it. You never told anyone. Told plenty of people. Just never made a fuss about it. Wasn't safe to make a fuss. Not back then. Not with the kind of men who ran things. I kept my head down, did my work, saved what I could, and got out quiet. Built this place with what was left. Never looked back." Evie studied the older woman's face. Weathered in line but steady. The face of someone who had made peace with a hard choice a long time ago. "Doesn't it eat at you?" Evie asked. "Staying quiet about it. Every day," Martha admitted. "But quiet kept me alive. Quiet let me build something. I made my peace with that trade a long time ago. I don't think I can make that same peace," Evie said. Martha looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable crossing her face. Not disapproval. Something closer to recognition. Maybe even a little envy. "No," she said finally. "I don't imagine you can. You've got a fire in you I never had. Or maybe I had it once, and it got put out too early to matter. Either way, Don't let anybody talk you into swallowing it. The world's got enough quiet women in it already. That night, after Martha had gone to bed, Evie sat alone on the porch with a basket of mending she hadn't touched in an hour, staring instead at the dark shape of the mountains against the sky. Gideon came out to take his watch and found her still sitting there. "You're up late," he said. Thinking, he sat down in his usual spot, rifle across his knees, and waited. He'd learned by now that Evie talked when she was ready, and not a moment before. And pushing her only made her retreat further into herself. "Martha told me about her past tonight," Evie said eventually, "about the family she used to belong to. She's been carrying that quiet for 15 years. She's still standing," Gideon said. "Built something good out of it, too. That's not nothing, I know. But I keep thinking about all the other women like her, like me, all of them staying quiet, all of them making their peace, generation after generation, and nothing ever changing because nobody's willing to be loud about it." Gideon turned to look at her. "You planning on being loud about it?" "I don't know what I'm planning yet," Evie admitted, "but I know I can't do what Martha did. I can't just build a quiet life around the edges of what happened to me and call it enough. Somebody's got to break the cycle somewhere. Might as well be me." Gideon didn't say anything to that right away. He thought about his own mother, about her quiet, about how it hadn't saved her in the end anyway. He thought about the ledger Evie had mentioned once, briefly, back at the ranch, before everything happened. The book Jeremiah kept locked away. The one that supposedly held every dirty contract the Blackwoods ever wrote. "You said something once," he said, "back before I got you out, about a ledger." Evie went very still. "How do you know about that?" "You mentioned it. Delirious, mostly. First night we got here. Didn't think much of it at the time." Evie was quiet for a long moment, weighing something in her mind. Then she nodded, slow, like she'd finally decided to trust him with it. "I saw it once," she said. "Jeremiah keeps it locked in his study. Every contract, every woman, every dollar exchanged. 15 years of it, maybe more. All written down in his own hand, like a rancher tracking cattle. That's evidence. That's a death sentence for anybody caught looking at it," Evie said. "But yes, it's evidence. Enough to bring the whole operation down, if it ever got in front of the right judge." Gideon leaned back in his chair, turning that over. "Why keep it? Then man like Jeremiah, why not burn the thing?" "Pride," Evie said. "Or maybe insurance. Men like that always think they're untouchable, right up until they aren't. He probably keeps it as leverage against his own partners as much as anything." "That's a dangerous thing to know about," Gideon said. "I know." Neither of them said anything else that night, but Evie's mending sat forgotten in the basket beside her chair, and Gideon's eyes stayed fixed on the dark road out of town for a good while longer than usual, both of them turning the same thought over in their own private way, neither one ready yet to say it out loud. Something had shifted in the direction their story was heading. It wasn't just about running anymore. It wasn't just about hiding in purgatory and hoping the Blackwoods lost interest eventually. There was a ledger out there with the truth written in it. And truth, once it started moving, had a way of demanding to be let loose. The canyon Gideon picked for shooting practice sat about 3 miles outside Purgatory, a dry gash in the earth, walled in on both sides by red rock, far enough from town that the noise wouldn't draw attention. He'd set up a row of bottles along a fallen log, the same 6 bottles he used every morning. And Evie had gotten good enough by now that she rarely missed more than 1 or 2. "Elbow in," Gideon said, watching her stance. "You're flaring it out again." Evie adjusted, tucked her elbow, and fired. The bottle on the far left exploded into a spray of glass. "Better," Gideon said. She reloaded without being told, her hands moving through the motions with a confidence that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. Gideon watched her work and felt something he wasn't entirely comfortable naming. Pride, maybe, or something close enough to it. "You've got good hands," he said. "Steady had a good teacher," Evie said, not looking up from her work. They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that had grown between them over these weeks of practice, filled only by the occasional crack of gunfire and the dry wind moving through the canyon. When Evie finished the last round, she set the gun down on the log and turned to face him, something serious settling over her expression. "I want to tell you something," she said, "about the ledger." Gideon leaned against the rock wall, arms crossed, giving her his full attention. "Go on." "I've been thinking about it since that night on the porch, about what it would mean to actually get our hands on it, not just to survive, not just to hide out here forever, but to actually put a stop to what the Blackwoods are doing. That's a tall order, I know, but I keep thinking about all the women who came before me, the ones Martha mentioned, the ones nobody ever wrote down, nobody ever counted, because the men who owned them made sure their names never made it into any official record except that ledger. If we got it in front of a federal judge, it wouldn't just save me. It could save every woman still trapped in that system." Gideon was quiet for a moment, watching her. There was something different in her now, something that hadn't been there when he first found her, kneeling in the dirt at Blackwood Ranch. Back then she'd been surviving. Now she was planning. "You understand what you're asking," he said, walking back into that house, getting anywhere near Jeremiah's study. "I understand it's dangerous. Dangerous doesn't cover it. It's suicide, going in there without a plan." "Then we make a plan," Evie said. "That's what you do, isn't it? Plan things out before you go charging in." Gideon almost smiled at that. She'd learned more about him in 3 weeks than most people managed in years. "I got a better idea," he said, straightening up from the wall. "Simpler one." "What's that?" "I ride out there myself. Tonight, if I move fast enough. Put a bullet in Jeremiah before he even knows what's coming. Man like that, causing all this misery. World's better off without him breathing in it." He started toward his horse, tied a short distance away, already running through the route in his head. Evie moved fast, faster than he expected, and put herself directly between him and the animal. "No," she said. "Evie," I said no. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now, something fierce and unshakable. "You shoot Jeremiah, and what happens? Abigail steps in, or some other Blackwood cousin, or one of his business partners, and the whole operation keeps right on running, same as before, just with a different name, signing the contracts. You'll have blood on your hands for nothing. Better a bullet than watching more women go through what you went through." "A bullet fixes one problem for one night," Evie said. "It doesn't fix the system that makes his crimes legal in the first place. That's the part you're missing. Jeremiah isn't the disease. He's just the symptom that happened to be standing closest to me. Kill him, and the disease keeps spreading through somebody else's hands." Gideon stood there, his hands still resting on the saddle horn, caught between the plan he'd already half committed to and the truth of what she was saying. He'd spent his whole life solving problems with a gun. It was the only language he really trusted. But she wasn't wrong. And some part of him had known she wasn't wrong from the moment she said it. "So what do you suggest?" he said, finally. "We just let him keep doing what he's doing while we sit around planning. We smash the system that lets him do it," Evie said. "That ledger isn't just evidence against Jeremiah. It's evidence against every contract, every arrangement, every crooked piece of paper that made this whole ugly business look legal in the eyes of the law. Get it in front of the right people. And it's not just Jeremiah who falls. The whole rotten structure comes down with him." Gideon let go of the saddle horn and turned to face her fully. "You've thought about this a lot." "I've had a lot of time to think," Evie said, sitting in that boarding house, mending shirts, watching you clean that rifle every night. I've thought about what kind of world I want to walk back into, if we ever manage to walk back into anything at all. And I know a bullet in Jeremiah's chest doesn't build that world. It just clears one obstacle out of the way, and the ledger does. The ledger is proof," Evie said. "Proof changes minds. Proof puts men in front of judges instead of graves. And it does it in a way that can't be undone by the next man who wants to pick up where Jeremiah left off. You want to save women you'll never meet. Women who haven't even been caught up in this yet. That's how you do it. Not with a gun in the dark. With the truth, dragged out into the light where everybody has to look at it." Gideon studied her face for a long moment. The wind moved through the canyon, kicking up a little dust around their boots. And somewhere overhead, a hawk called out, circling. "All right," he said finally. "We do it your way." Something in Evie's shoulders eased, just slightly. The tension she'd been carrying since she planted herself in front of his horse finally loosening. "But," Gideon added, "we do it careful. No charging in blind. We find out where he keeps it, who guards it, how we get in and out without getting caught. This isn't a quick job. Might take weeks to plan proper." "I can wait weeks," Evie said. "I've waited longer for less." Gideon nodded. And together they walked back toward the fallen log, where the bottles still sat, most of them shattered now from the morning's practice. He picked up the last unbroken bottle, set it upright on the log, and stepped back. "One more round," he said. "Then we head back to town and start figuring out how we're gonna pull this off." Evie lifted the revolver, sighted down the barrel, and fired. The bottle burst into pieces, the sound cracking out across the canyon and fading into silence. "Good shot," Gideon said. "Had a good reason," Evie replied. And for the first time since he'd known her, there was something almost like hope in her voice, quiet but unmistakable. The sound of a woman who had stopped merely surviving and started fighting for something bigger than herself. They rode back to Purgatory as the sun dropped low over the western hills, and somewhere behind them, unseen and unsuspecting, the Blackwood Empire kept right on turning, unaware that the woman it had tried to brand as property was already planning its downfall with nothing more than her own steady hands and an old gunslinger's borrowed conscience. Cheyenne looked nothing like Purgatory, where the mining town wore its lawlessness plain on its face. Cheyenne dressed its corruption up in fine clothes and called it business. The hotel where the cattle baron's poker and auction night was held sat on the finest street in town, 3 stories of brick and glass, lit up gold from every window. Gideon stood outside in a borrowed suit that fit him wrong across the shoulders, feeling like a man wearing another man's skin. Beside him, Evie wore a deep green dress Martha had helped alter, her hair pinned up in a style that made her look like she belonged in a place like this, which was exactly the point. "You remember the plan," Gideon said quietly, watching the carriages roll up to the entrance. "I get inside. I find a way close to the auction floor. You work the edges, watch the exits, and if anything goes wrong, we meet at the stable 2 blocks east." Evie smoothed the front of her dress with hands that were steadier than Gideon expected, given what they were about to walk into. "I remember. If you see him, Jeremiah, you don't approach him. You don't so much as look at him twice. I know, I mean it. Evie." She turned and looked at him then, something sharp in her eyes. "I spent 3 weeks learning to load a gun blind and reholster it in under 4 seconds. I think I can manage not staring at a man across a crowded room." Gideon almost smiled despite himself. Fair enough. They walked in through the front doors separately, 5 minutes apart, just like they'd planned. Gideon presented forged papers to the man checking names at the door, papers Evie had helped him draft, claiming him as a cattle buyer up from Texas looking to make connections. The lie held. It usually did. In a room full of men more interested in showing off their own importance than questioning anyone else's. Inside, the ballroom had been converted for the evening. Poker tables scattered along one wall, a long buffet running the length of another, and at the far end, a raised platform where the real business of the night would happen once the drinking got serious enough that nobody minded. Watching it happen in plain sight, Gideon had heard about auctions like this one before, always secondhand, always in the kind of hushed voice men used when they were ashamed of a thing, but not ashamed enough to stop attending. Women sold off like breeding stock, dressed up and paraded across that platform, while cattle barons and mine owners bid on contracts that gave them ownership over another human life. All of it wrapped in enough legal language to look respectable to anyone who didn't look too close. He found a spot near the bar, ordered a whiskey he had no intention of drinking, and watched the room. Evie moved through the crowd with a confidence that surprised him, striking up conversation with a cluster of well-dressed women near the buffet, laughing at something one of them said, playing the part of a wealthy rancher's wife so well that Gideon almost forgot, for a moment, what she'd looked like kneeling in the dirt at Blackwood Ranch 6 weeks earlier. It took nearly an hour before she found her way toward the poker tables at the center of the room, where the real Power and Cheyenne sat playing cards and pretending the auction platform in the corner was nothing more than background decoration. Gideon watched her go still. He followed her gaze and found the source of it. A woman sat at the head table, dressed finer than anyone else in the room. Her dark hair swept up under a hat trimmed with peacock feathers. A leather ledger open on the table in front of her, like she was reviewing a business report rather than a list of human beings bought and sold. Evie made her way to Gideon's side at the bar, her face pale under her careful composure. "That's her," she whispered. "Her who?" "Abigail Blackwood, Jeremiah's sister." Gideon studied the woman more closely. She sat with the easy authority of someone born to a room like this, flipping through the pages of the ledger with a bored expression, occasionally leaning over to whisper something to the men seated near her, all of whom nodded like her word carried more weight than anyone else's at the table. "I thought Jeremiah ran things," Gideon said. "So did I," Evie said quietly. "I always assumed Jeremiah wrote those contracts, made the deals. But look at her. Look at how those men are treating her." Gideon watched a mine owner lean in and murmur something to Abigail, and watched her answer with a small, precise gesture toward the ledger, like she was quoting a clause from memory. The man nodded and reached for his checkbook. "She's the one running the numbers," Gideon said slowly, understanding, dawning. "Jeremiah's just the muscle, the face everybody sees and blames. She's the one who built the whole operation." "A woman selling other women," Evie said, and there was something in her voice that went beyond anger, something closer to a wound reopening. "I don't understand how anybody could do that, how anybody could look at what happened to me, to Martha, to God knows how many others, and decide the smart move was to profit off it instead of stopping it. Some folks decide the only way to survive a rigged game is to deal the cards themselves," Gideon said. "Doesn't make it right. Just means it's a different kind of wrong than we expected to find." They watched a while longer. Abigail ran the table with a cold efficiency that was somehow more chilling than Jeremiah's brute force had ever been. He'd caged Evie with fear and violence. Abigail did it with paperwork and precedent, with legal language crafted to survive any judge fool enough to look too closely. And she did it while sipping champagne and laughing at some joke from the man beside her. "We need to get closer to that ledger," Evie said. "Not tonight, Gideon, not tonight," he repeated, firm. "That's her personal copy, and she's got it in arm's reach the whole evening. We go anywhere near that table, we're both dead before we make it to the door. We watch, we learn what we can. We come back another night with an actual plan." Evie's jaw tightened, but she nodded, understanding the sense in it, even if every instinct in her wanted to close the distance right then and grab the truth sitting 20 feet away. They stayed another hour, gathering what they could. Gideon noted the two armed men who stood near the exits, dressed like waitstaff, but carrying themselves like hired guns. Evie listened to snatches of conversation from the women around her, learning which mine owners and ranchers had accounts with the Blackwoods, which judges had been paid to look the other way, which sheriffs took a cut to keep their eyes closed. It was nearly midnight when the auction platform lit up and the real business of the evening began. A young woman, no older than 16 by Gideon's guess, was led up onto the stage in a white dress, her eyes fixed somewhere on the middle distance. The particular emptiness of someone who had learned a long time ago that feeling anything about her own circumstances only made the circumstances harder to bear. Evie's hand found Gideon's arm, gripping hard enough to leave marks. "We have to do something," she whispered. "Not tonight," Gideon said again, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth, even as he said them. "We do something now. We blow 6 weeks of planning, and we don't save her either. We come back with the ledger, with proof, and we shut this whole business down for good. That's how we save all of them. Not just the one on that stage tonight." Evie's grip didn't loosen, but she nodded, tears standing in her eyes that she refused to let fall in a room full of men who would have called them weakness. "I hate this," she said. "I hate that we have to stand here and watch and do nothing." "I know. How do you stand it?" "Watching things like this happen and not acting." "I don't," Gideon said quietly. "Not really. I just remember that acting wrong gets more people hurt than acting careful. Took me a long time to learn that. Longer than I'd like to admit." They left separately, the way they'd come in, and met up 2 blocks east, where Gideon had left the horses. Evie was quiet on the ride back to their rented room at the edge of town, her eyes fixed somewhere far off, and Gideon let her have the silence, understanding. There were some things a person needed to sit with before they could talk about them. It wasn't until they were nearly back that she finally spoke. "I keep thinking about her," Evie said. "Abigail. What kind of woman does that to other women? The kind who decided a long time ago that being the one holding the whip was safer than being the one it's used on." Gideon said. "Doesn't excuse it. But I imagine that's the shape of it. That's not a choice I understand." "No," Gideon agreed. "I don't imagine you ever will. And that's a good thing about you. Evelyn Thorne means whatever this world did to you, it didn't manage to twist you into believing the only way out was stepping on somebody else to get there." Evie didn't answer that, but something in her posture shifted. Some of the tension from the night finally easing as they rode the last stretch back toward town. The two of them silent under a wide Wyoming sky, both thinking about the ledger sitting in that fine hotel room, and the long road still ahead of them before it would end up somewhere it could finally do some good. The trouble started before they even made it out of Cheyenne. Gideon felt it before he saw it. A prickle at the back of his neck as they walked their horses down a side street toward the edge of town. The kind of feeling that had kept him alive more times than he could count. "Someone's following us," he murmured to Evie. "Are you sure? Don't look back. Just keep walking." They'd made it another block before the first shot rang out, splintering the wood post beside Gideon's head. He grabbed Evie and shoved her behind a water trough as 2 more shots followed, and then the street erupted into chaos. 3 men breaking from the shadows with guns drawn. Men Gideon recognized from the hotel. The ones dressed up like waitstaff who'd clearly been watching closer than he'd given them credit for. "Somebody made us," Gideon said, drawing his revolver and returning fire, catching one man in the shoulder and sending him spinning into the dirt. "Abigail must have had eyes on the room the whole night. What do we do?" "We run." They broke for the horses, Gideon laying down cover fire while Evie swung up into her saddle. And then they were tearing down the street at a dead gallop, bullets chasing them past the edge of town and out into the open dark beyond. The men on their tail mounting up fast enough that the chase didn't slow for nearly 2 miles. A bullet caught Gideon in the side just past the 3rd mile, a burning line of pain that nearly took him out of the saddle. He gritted his teeth and kept riding, blood soaking warm through his shirt, following Evie's lead as she cut hard toward a rocky outcrop she'd spotted rising up out of the plains ahead. They lost their pursuers somewhere in the dark, the men either giving up the chase or losing the trail in the confusion of the night. And by the time Evie finally reined in, near a shallow cave mouth carved into the rock, Gideon was slumped forward in his saddle, barely conscious, blood soaking through to his belt. Gideon. Evie was off her horse and at his side before he'd fully registered stopping. "Gideon, stay with me." "I'm fine," he managed, though the words came out slurred and unconvincing. "You're not fine. You've been shot." She got an arm under him and helped him down, half carrying him into the shelter of the cave as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. A storm that had been building all evening, finally breaking loose over the plains. Inside the cave, dry and shielded from the wind, Evie got him settled against the rock wall and pulled his shirt open to examine the wound. The bullet had caught him high on his left side, not through anything vital, as far as she could tell, but deep enough that it needed to come out. "I need a fire," she said, more to herself than to him. "And water, and something sharp." She worked fast, gathering what dry wood she could find near the cave mouth, getting a small fire going, despite the rain hammering down outside, and setting a pot of water she'd carried from their saddlebags to boil. She found Gideon's hunting knife in his belt and held the blade over the flame until it glowed, the way she'd seen a camp doctor do once, years ago, on a wagon train, before everything in her life went sideways. "This is gonna hurt," she warned him. "Figured as much," Gideon said through gritted teeth. She worked the bullet, free with hands that shook, but never stopped moving. Gideon's jaw clenched so hard she could hear his teeth grinding. Until finally the metal came loose, and she pressed a clean strip of cloth against the wound to stop the bleeding. "There," she said, tying the bandage off. "Live." Had my doubts there for a minute. "You should have told me you were hit sooner." Didn't want to slow us down. Evie sat back against the cave wall beside him, both of them soaked through and exhausted, the fire crackling low between them, and the storm still raging outside the cave mouth. For a long while, neither of them spoke, just breathing in the quiet aftermath of everything that had happened, the adrenaline slowly draining out of both their bodies. "You could have died tonight," Evie said finally. "Wouldn't have been the first time somebody tried." "That's not an answer." Gideon looked over at her, firelight catching the worry still etched into her face, and something in him gave way. Some wall he'd kept up for longer than he could remember. "My mother," he said quietly. "You asked me once, back at the ranch, why I did what I did, why I pulled you out of that circle. I never told you the whole truth of it." Evie stayed quiet, giving him room to continue. "She belonged to a man outside Abilene. Same kind of arrangement as you had with Jeremiah. Different family. Same rot underneath it. I was 9 years old. I watched him put his boot on her neck one night for the crime of speaking out of turn, and I couldn't do a damn thing about it. Too small, too scared." His voice went rough. "She died 2 years later. Worked to death, mostly, though nobody ever wrote it down that way." "Gideon." Evie's hand found his in the dark. "When I saw you kneeling in that dirt, with that iron coming down toward your shoulder, I saw her. Same look in your eyes she had right before the end. Same refusal to break, even when everything around you was trying to force you to." He turned to look at her fully now. "I couldn't save her. I told myself a long time ago I'd never get close enough to anybody to feel that helpless again. And then I saw you. And every promise I'd made myself just came apart." Evie's eyes were wet, though, whether from the story or from something else entirely, Gideon couldn't say. She reached up and touched the side of his face, gentle, careful of the pain she knew he was still carrying from the wound. "I'm sorry," she said, "about your mother. I'm not looking for sympathy. Just wanted you to understand why I did what I did, why I keep doing it." "I understand," Evie said softly. "More than you know." The rain kept falling outside, steady and constant, and the fire kept the cave warm despite the chill of the storm. And somewhere in that quiet space between them, something shifted that had been building since the moment Gideon first drew his gun in Jeremiah's yard. Evie leaned in first. Gideon met her halfway, and their first kiss was slow, careful, both of them moving like they were afraid the moment might shatter if handled too roughly. When they finally broke apart, Evie rested her forehead against his, both of them breathing unsteady in the firelight. "This doesn't change anything about the plan," she said quietly. "No," Gideon agreed. "It doesn't. We still get that ledger. We still bring the whole rotten business down. We will. But I wanted you to know," Evie said, pulling back just enough to look him in the eye, "that whatever happens after that, whatever this is between us, it's my choice, nobody else's. I decide who gets close to me now. I decide what I give and to who. I wouldn't have it any other way," Gideon said. Outside, the storm raged on through the night, but inside the cave, two people who had both spent too long feeling powerless in the hands of others found something steady in each other, built not on rescue or ownership, but on the simple, quiet fact that both of them had chosen it freely. And that made all the difference in the world. They made it back to purgatory 3 days later, Gideon's wound healing slow but clean. Both of them changed in ways neither had fully put into words yet. But the peace didn't last long. Evie woke on the 4th night to the sound of gunfire and shouting outside Martha's boarding house. And by the time she made it to the window, She could see torches moving through the street below. A dozen men on horseback surrounding the building. Jeremiah's men. Gideon was already awake, rifle in hand, moving toward the stairs when Evie caught his arm. Wait, they're here for you. We need to move. Now, Evie said, and there was something in her voice that stopped him cold. Listen to me. This is a chance to get you killed. A chance to get inside the ranch, Evie said, gripping his arm tight. Think about it, Gideon. They're not here to burn the place down. They're here to take me back. If I go quiet, if I let them, they'll bring me straight to Jeremiah's house, straight to the study where that ledger's kept. That's insane. It's the fastest way in we're ever going to get, Evie said. You've been trying to plan a way to sneak into that ranch for weeks now. Here it is, walking right up to the front door and knocking. I am not letting them take you. You're not letting them do anything, Evie said. I'm choosing to let them take me. There's a difference, and you know it. She held his gaze, steady, despite the chaos building outside. You slip out the back while they're distracted, dragging me out front. You circle around, get onto the property after dark, and you find that ledger while everybody's attention is on me. It's the only plan that actually works. Gideon's jaw was tight enough to crack, and if something goes wrong, if Jeremiah decides to finish what he started at that forge, then you'll be inside the house already, and you'll do something about it, Evie said. I trust you to get there in time. I trust myself to survive until you do. Downstairs, the shouting grew louder, boots pounding on the front porch. Martha's voice raised in furious protest against men who clearly didn't care what she had to say about it. Evie, there's no time to argue, she said, already moving toward the door. Trust me. Please. Gideon stood frozen for one agonizing second, every instinct screaming at him to grab her and run, before he finally nodded, jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. I'll be there, he said. Whatever happens, I'll be there. I know, Evie said, and then she was gone, moving down the stairs toward the men waiting below. Her chin lifted, her spine straight, walking toward danger on her own terms, instead of waiting for it to drag her there by force. Gideon watched from the upstairs window as they hauled her out into the street, rougher than he could stomach, and it took every ounce of discipline he had not to charge down there and start shooting. But he held himself back, watching until the group mounted up and rode off into the dark with Evie among them. And only then did he slip out the back window and start making his own way toward the Blackwood Ranch on foot, keeping to the shadows, his wounded side aching with every step. Evie, meanwhile, sat rigid on the back of a horse she didn't control, surrounded by men who smelled of whiskey and violence, and forced herself to think past the fear clawing at her chest. She'd made a choice back at Martha's, and she needed to trust that choice now more than ever. They rode into the Blackwood Ranch just before dawn, and Evie found herself thrown into the same small room she'd been kept in before her escape months earlier. The same bare walls, the same locked door. But this time was different. This time she wasn't waiting to be saved. She was waiting for her moment. It came in the form of Deputy Caleb Reyes, a young lawman Evie had noticed before during her captivity, always hovering at the edges of Jeremiah's operation, with an expression that never quite matched the cruelty of the men around him. He brought her food that evening, setting the tray down without meeting her eyes. You don't want to be doing this job, Evie said quietly. Caleb's hand paused on the tray. Ma'am, I've watched you before. You flinch every time Jeremiah gives an order. You're not like the rest of them. I've got a badge to uphold, Caleb said, though the words came out less certain than he probably intended. A badge that answers to a man who brands women like cattle, Evie said. Is that the kind of law you signed up to protect? Caleb said nothing, but he didn't leave either, standing there in the doorway with the tray forgotten in his hands. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Caleb, Evie said, watching him carefully. It's being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. Every man in this house is terrified of Jeremiah. The difference is whether that fear makes you complicit or makes you finally stand up against it. You don't know what you're asking, Caleb said quietly. Man crosses Jeremiah Blackwood. There's no coming back from that. I'm not asking you to cross him tonight, Evie said. I'm asking you to think about who you want to be 10 years from now, when you look back on this moment. The man who kept the peace by protecting a monster, or the man who finally found the nerve to do something about it. Caleb didn't answer, but something had shifted in his expression, and when he finally left the room, locking the door behind him, Evie allowed herself the first small breath of hope she'd felt since the men dragged her from purgatory. Outside, under cover of full darkness, Gideon made his way onto the ranch property, moving low and silent through the shadows he knew better than any man alive. Thanks to the weeks he'd spent scouting the grounds before, ever pulling Evie out the first time, he found the study window on the east side of the main house, unguarded, and worked the latch open with the patient care of a man who'd broken into worse places for far less important reasons. Inside, the study sat dark and empty, moonlight falling across a heavy oak desk and a wall of locked cabinets. Gideon had no idea which one held the ledger, and no time to search them all before someone noticed the light under the door or heard him moving through the room. He needed help, and he needed it fast. He thought of Evie's words back in the canyon. Weeks ago now, we smashed the system that makes his crimes legal. He thought of his mother, of Martha, of the girl on that auction stage in Cheyenne with the empty eyes, and he settled in to wait, watching the door, trusting that somewhere else in this house, Evie was doing exactly what she'd promised she would. He didn't have to wait long. Just past midnight, the door to the study creaked open, and Deputy Caleb Reyes stepped through, a set of keys clutched in his shaking hand. She sent you, Gideon said quietly, stepping out of the shadows. Caleb startled hard, hand going to his sidearm before he recognized who was standing in front of him. You're the gunslinger, the one who took her the first time. I am, she talked to me, Caleb said, his voice unsteady but resolute. Said some things I couldn't stop thinking about. Told me I had a choice to make about what kind of man I wanted to be. He held out the keys. These open the cabinet behind the desk. That's where he keeps it. The ledger. Gideon took the keys, studying the young deputy's face. You understand what you're doing right now. Crossing him, I understand, Caleb said. Took me long enough, but I understand. Gideon crossed to the cabinet and unlocked it. And there, sitting on the top shelf, was a thick leather-bound book, exactly as Evie had described it. He pulled it free, feeling the weight of it in his hands. Weight that represented 15 years of stolen lives and broken families, all condensed down into ink and paper. Now we get her out, Gideon said, tucking the ledger under his arm. You know this house better than I do. Where are they keeping her? West Wing, Caleb said. Same room as before. But it's guarded, and Jeremiah's due to check on her personal before sunrise. Then we move fast, Gideon said, already heading for the door. And Deputy, whatever happens tonight, you did the right thing. Don't let anybody, including yourself, ever convince you otherwise. Caleb nodded, drawing his sidearm with hands that had finally stopped shaking. And together, the two men moved through the dark corridors of the Blackwood house, carrying between them both the evidence that could finally end this nightmare and the fragile, dangerous hope that they might just make it out before dawn broke over the ranch. Gideon and Caleb made it as far as the West Wing corridor before they heard boots coming from the other direction. Gideon shoved the ledger into Caleb's hands and impressed them both flat against the wall in the shadow of a doorway. Breath held, listening as two of Jeremiah's men walked past on their nightly rounds, close enough that Gideon could smell the tobacco on their coats. The footsteps faded. Gideon let out a slow breath and took the ledger back. West room, you said, end of the hall. Two guards outside the door. But they trade off with the men who just walked by. So we've got maybe 15 minutes before the next rotation. That's not much time. It's what we've got. They moved fast and quiet, and when they reached the end of the hall, Gideon didn't waste time with subtlety. He came around the corner with his revolver already up, catching both guards off balance, and had them disarmed and bound with their own belts before either man managed more than a startled shout. The door was locked, but Caleb had a key for that too, and when it swung open, Evie was already on her feet. having heard the commotion outside and prepared herself for whatever came through that door next, ready to fight if it came to that. She saw Gideon, and the tension went out of her all at once. "You came. Told you I would." He crossed the room in 3 steps and pulled her into him, holding on tight enough that she felt the last of her fear finally drain away. "We've got the ledger. We need to move." They made it out through the same window Gideon had come in through, the 3 of them slipping through the dark grounds toward the tree line where Gideon had left his horse. And they'd nearly made it clear when a shout went up behind them. One of the freed guards having worked loose of his bindings faster than expected. "Run," Gideon said, and they did, breaking for the horse at a dead sprint as more shouts joined the first and torches began flaring to life across the ranch behind them. They made it to Purgatory just as the sky was starting to gray with early dawn. Exhausted, filthy but alive. The ledger safe in Gideon's saddlebag. Martha was waiting on the porch when they rode in, her shotgun across her knees, and the relief on her face when she saw Evie was plain enough to see from 50 yards out. But the relief didn't last. By midday, word had reached town that Jeremiah Blackwood was riding for Purgatory with every armed man he could gather, furious over the stolen ledger and the deputy who'd betrayed him, intent on burning the whole town down if that's what it took to get both back. Gideon spent the afternoon in the boarding house stable, saddling his horse with the grim, methodical focus of a man preparing for something he didn't expect to survive. Evie found him there just past noon. "What are you doing?" "What needs doing? You're going alone. This isn't your fight to finish. Evie, you did your part. You got the ledger out. Now I finish it before Jeremiah brings this whole town down around Martha's ears looking for you. That's not your decision to make," Evie said, stepping in front of the horse the same way she had once before, weeks ago, in a dry canyon outside town. "We agreed. No more solving things alone with a gun. This is different." "It's exactly the same," Evie said. "You're right out there alone. You die a hero nobody remembers. And Jeremiah still burns this town down out of spite because there's nobody left to stop him. I won't let you throw your life away like that. Not after everything." Gideon's jaw tightened. But before he could answer, the stable door banged open and Martha strode in, shotgun in hand, her face set with a resolve Evie had never seen on her before. "You're not riding out there alone, either," Martha said. "Martha, 15 years I kept my mouth shut," Martha said, cutting him off. 15 years I told myself quiet was the safe way, the smart way. And maybe it was, for a while. But I'm done being quiet. Gideon Hayes. That family has taken enough from women in this territory. I'm not standing by and watching them take this town too." She walked past him, out through the stable doors and into the street, and Gideon and Evie followed close behind to find that word had already spread through Purgatory. Miners and shopkeepers and saloon girls all gathering in the muddy main street, drawn by whispers of what Jeremiah's men had done and what the ledger held. Martha climbed up onto an overturned crate outside the general store, shotgun raised over her head. "You all know me," she called out to the gathering crowd. 15 years I've run that boarding house, kept my head down, never asked for trouble. Well, trouble's riding this way regardless, and it's got Jeremiah Blackwood's name on it. That man and his sister have been buying and selling women in this territory for longer than most of you have lived here, using contracts and paperwork to make it look legal. And today we've got proof of it, written in their own hand. A murmur ran through the crowd, uneasy, uncertain. "I know most of you never wanted trouble with the Blackwoods," Martha continued. "I understand that better than anybody. But that man is riding here right now to burn this town to the ground, looking for a woman who did nothing wrong except refuse to stay somebody's property. If we don't stand together today, there won't be a Purgatory left standing to protect tomorrow." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then an older miner near the front, a man Evie recognized as one of Martha's longtime boarders, stepped forward and hefted his rifle. "I've got no love for Blackwood cattle money," he said. "Never trusted a man who does business that particular way." Another man joined him, and then another. until a good portion of the crowd stood armed and ready. Farmers and miners and shopkeepers who'd never held a gun in anger in their lives, but were willing to now, because Martha's 15 years of silence had finally found its voice, and that voice had lit something in the whole town. Gideon looked out over the gathering crowd, then back at Martha, standing tall on her crate, with the shotgun still raised. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "Yes, I did," Martha said, stepping down. "Should have done it a long time ago." Better late than never. Inside the boarding house, Evie made her own preparations, though hers looked different from the men checking their rifles in the street. She sat at the small writing desk in her room and pulled out paper and ink, and began copying out the most damning pages of the ledger by hand, page after page of names and dates and dollar amounts. Evidence that needed to survive, even if the original book somehow didn't. She was 3 pages in when a knock came at her door. Deputy Caleb stood in the hallway. Still, the borrowed clothes Martha had given him after his desertion from Jeremiah's service, looking uncertain but resolved. "I want to help," he said. "Whatever's coming. I want to be part of stopping it." "You already helped," Evie said. "You got us the keys. You could have stayed loyal to your badge and your paycheck. Instead, you chose right over easy." "Doesn't feel like enough," Caleb admitted. "It rarely does," Evie said, "but it's how it starts. One person deciding they won't look away anymore, then another. Look outside, Caleb. Look at what Martha built in 20 minutes, just by refusing to stay silent one more day." Caleb looked, and something steadied in his face at the sight of the town gathering in the street below, armed and resolved. "There's a study back at the Blackwood house," Evie said. "Abigail's, not Jeremiah's. That's where the rest of the operation lives. The contract's still in progress. The ones that haven't made it into this ledger yet, if we're going to end this properly. Somebody needs to get in there, while the fighting draws Jeremiah's attention elsewhere." "You're not thinking of going back?" "I am," Evie said, "but not to fight Jeremiah. Gideon and the town can handle that end of it. I'm going after Abigail, and I'm going to need your help getting there." Caleb studied her for a long moment, then nodded, understanding settling over him with the weight of a decision already made. "Tell me what you need," he said, outside. Gideon finished checking his rifle one last time as the sun began its slow slide toward afternoon. The whole town of Purgatory gathered behind him now, farmers and miners and shopkeepers who'd chosen, in the space of a single morning, to stop looking the other way. Martha stood at the front of the group, shotgun steady in her hands, and beside her, Gideon caught sight of Evie, walking out from the boarding house with Caleb at her side, a folded stack of copied papers tucked inside her coat, and a look on her face that told him she had a plan of her own already in motion. "You're not staying behind," he said, though it wasn't really a question. "Never intended to." Evie said, "You handle Jeremiah with the town behind you. Caleb and I are going after Abigail, and the rest of what's hiding in that study." Gideon looked at her, at the steady resolve in her eyes, and felt something that might have been pride settle over the fear still gripping his chest. "All right," he said, "then let's finish this." In the distance, the first riders appeared on the horizon. Jeremiah Blackwood at the head of a small army of hired guns, closing fast on a town that had finally decided it was done being afraid. The dust storm rolled in just as Jeremiah's riders crossed the last ridge before Purgatory, kicked up by a hot wind that had been building all morning, turning the sky the color of old rust and swallowing the horizon whole. Gideon stood at the front of the gathered townsfolk, rifle steady in his hands, watching the riders approach through the haze. Beside him, Martha held her shotgun with the same steady grip she'd carried since climbing down off that crate, and around them both, the men and women of Purgatory stood their ground, armed with whatever they'd had on hand, and united by a resolve none of them had expected to find in themselves that morning. Jeremiah reined up 30 yards out, his men fanning behind him, and for a long moment the two sides simply stared each other down through the swirling dust. "You're harboring a thief and a runaway," Jeremiah called out. "Hand them over, and there's no need for anybody else to get hurt today." "Ain't nobody here handing over anybody," Martha shouted back. Not to a man who buys and sells women like cattle. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth. And we've got the proof to back it, Gideon called out. Ledger's already safe, Jeremiah. Whole territory's about to know exactly what kind of business you've been running out of that ranch. Jeremiah's face went hard, and Gideon saw the moment the man decided words weren't going to settle this. He raised his hand, and his line of riders surged forward. And the fight that followed came fast and brutal, gunfire cracking through the swirling dust as the town of Purgatory made its stand. Gideon moved through the chaos with the focused calm of a man who'd survived 100 fights like this one. But this time was different. This time he wasn't fighting for a paycheck or his own survival. He was fighting for a town that had chosen, in a single morning, to stop being afraid. And that made every shot land with a weight it had never carried before. He found Jeremiah in the thick of the fighting, the two men squaring off in the middle of the street as the storm raged around them, visibility dropping to near nothing. As the wind howled and the dust turned the whole world the color of dried blood. You had a good thing going. Haze, Jeremiah shouted over the wind. Could have been rich working for me. Instead, you throw it all away for a woman who ain't even worth the trouble. You don't get to say her name, Gideon said, leveling his revolver. Jeremiah went for his own gun, but Gideon was faster, had always been faster, and his shot caught Jeremiah's revolver clean out of his hand before the man's finger even found the trigger. Jeremiah dropped to his knees in the dirt, cradling his ruined hand. The fight finally gone out of him as the rest of his hired men, seeing their employer fallen, began throwing down their weapons around the street, while the battle raged outside. Evie and Caleb had made their way onto the Blackwood property through the same route Gideon had used the night before. Slipping past the skeleton crew of guards Jeremiah had left behind, most of his men having ridden out to Purgatory with him. They found Abigail Blackwood in her study, exactly where Evie expected her to be, the woman moving with frantic efficiency as she poured kerosene over a stack of papers spread across her desk. The family's secondary records, the ones that hadn't yet made it into the main ledger, Gideon had already stolen. Stop, Evie said from the doorway. Abigail looked up, startled but recovering fast, her composure sliding back into place like a mask. Miss Thorne, I wondered when you'd show your face again. You're burning the evidence. I'm protecting my family's business, Abigail said, striking a match. Something you clearly wouldn't understand, given your circumstances. I understand plenty, Evie said, stepping into the room. I understand you built an empire on other women's suffering and called it smart business. I understand you looked at what happened to me, to Martha, to that girl on the stage in Cheyenne, and decided the profitable move was to keep doing it. The world runs on hard choices, Abigail said, dropping the match toward the papers. Evie moved fast, closing the distance and knocking the match from Abigail's hand before it caught. And then the two women were grappling across the desk, sending papers and inkwells crashing to the floor as they fought. All pretense of refinement gone from Abigail's face now, replaced by something raw and desperate. The kerosene-soaked papers caught anyway, a stray spark from the overturned lamp finding purchase, and flames began licking up the side of the desk as the two women rolled across the floor, fighting for control. Caleb tried to pull them apart, but Abigail broke free first, scrambling for the burning desk, reaching for the last stack of papers that hadn't yet caught fire, the final piece of evidence that could tie her directly to the operation. Evie lunged after her, plunging her bare hands into the edge of the flames to grab the papers before Abigail could destroy them, the heat scorching her skin as she pulled the charred, smoking pages free and clutched them to her chest. Let it burn, Abigail hissed, grabbing for the papers again. You don't understand what you're doing. Without proof, it's just your word against mine. And nobody's going to believe a runaway over a Blackwood. They will, Evie said, backing away from the spreading fire. Papers held tight, despite the burns already rising on her fingers. Because I'm not the only one who's finally stopped staying quiet. The study door burst open, and Deputy Caleb stood there with his badge pinned back on his chest, having retrieved it from wherever he'd stashed it after fleeing Jeremiah's service. And behind him stood two more lawmen from the county seat, summoned by a rider Martha had sent out at first light that morning. "Abigail Blackwood," Caleb said, stepping forward with cuffs already in hand. "You're under arrest for fraud, human trafficking, and a list of crimes long enough to keep a judge busy for a month reading it." Abigail's composure finally shattered completely, her eyes darting toward the burning desk, toward the window, looking for any way out that didn't end with those cuffs closing around her wrists. But there wasn't one. The fire had spread too far, the room filling with smoke. And outside, the sound of gunfire from the street had finally gone quiet, replaced by the low murmur of a town that had won its fight. Caleb clicked the cuffs shut, and Abigail Blackwood, the true architect of an empire built on stolen lives, finally faced the justice she'd spent years buying her way around. Evie stumbled out of the burning study with Caleb's help, the salvaged papers still clutched against her chest, despite the raw burns covering her palms, and found Gideon waiting in the yard outside, having left the aftermath of the street fight to search for her the moment the shooting stopped. He crossed the distance between them at a run, catching her as her legs finally gave out from exhaustion and pain. "You're hurt," he said, seeing her burned hands. "I'm alive," Evie said. "That's more than I expected this morning." Behind them, the study continued to burn. But the papers in Evie's arms, the ones that mattered most, had survived the flames. Smoke-stained and singed at the edges, but intact enough to read every damning word. Caleb led Abigail out toward the waiting lawman and across the yard. Gideon caught sight of two more deputies bringing Jeremiah out in similar restraints, his ruined hand wrapped in a makeshift bandage, all the fight finally drained out of him. The Blackwood Empire, built over 15 years on the suffering of countless women whose names had never made it into any official record until now, came crashing down in the space of a single storm-swept morning, undone not by a bullet in the dark, but by a ledger, a deputy who found his courage, a town that finally stopped looking away, and a woman who refused to let her own suffering be the last chapter of the story. Spring came slow to the Wyoming plains that year, but when it finally arrived, it arrived like it meant to make up for lost time. Wildflowers pushed up through ground that had been frozen for months, and the wind off the mountains carried the smell of new grass instead of wood smoke. And in the town of Purgatory, a town that had earned a new name in the months since the fall of the Blackwoods, life had begun again in earnest. Jeremiah and Abigail Blackwood sat in a federal penitentiary now, their trial having drawn attention from as far away as Washington once the full scope of their operation became public record. The ledger, along with the papers Evie had pulled from the fire with her own bare hands, had done exactly what she'd promised it would. It had brought down not just two people, but the entire corrupt network of contracts and complicit officials that had allowed the operation to run unchecked for 15 years. Judges lost their positions. Sheriffs who'd taken bribes to look away found themselves facing charges of their own. The Blackwood land and holdings were seized by the federal government and, through a process that took the better part of the winter to sort out, eventually returned to public use. Evie stood now in the yard of a building that had once been part of that very land, a schoolhouse she'd built with her own hands over the winter months, funded in part by the seized Blackwood assets and in part by donations from townsfolk across the territory who'd heard her story and wanted to be part of what came next. In her hands she held the branding iron, the same one that had nearly touched her shoulder a year earlier at Blackwood Ranch, recovered from the wreckage of that circle of men, and kept ever since as a reminder of everything she'd survived. She carried it now to the blacksmith's forge that sat behind the schoolhouse, the coals already glowing hot, and without hesitation, she fed the iron into the flames. She watched it soften and glow, the cruel shape of that letter B slowly losing its form as the metal gave way to the heat. And when it was ready, she worked alongside the town's blacksmith to pour it into a new mold, one she'd designed herself over long winter evenings. sketching and resketching until she found the shape she wanted. A bell. It took 3 days for the casting to cool and finish properly, and on the morning it was ready. The whole town gathered to watch as Evie and Gideon hung it above the schoolhouse door, the bronze catching the morning light. No trace left of the instrument of torture it had once been. Gideon stood back once the bell was secured, watching Evie run her fingers along its surface. The burns on her palms, long since healed into thin white scars that she wore without shame. "Ring it," he said. "Should be you." Evie reached up and pulled the rope, and the bell rang out clear and bright across the plains, the sound carrying farther than either of them expected, rolling out over fields that had once belonged to men who thought they could own another human being, and now belonged to nobody but the people who worked them. Inside the schoolhouse, a dozen young women had already gathered, some of them former workers on Blackwood land, some of them women Evie had met through the trial proceedings who'd found their way to purgatory once word spread of what she was building. They sat at simple wooden desks, waiting for their first lesson, and when Evie walked in with the bell still ringing behind her, they looked up with an eagerness that reminded her powerfully of her own hunger to learn. All those months ago, sitting on Martha's porch, with a needle and thread in her hands, slowly stitching herself back together. "Today we start with contracts," Evie said, moving to the chalkboard at the front of the room, "because the most dangerous thing that was ever done to me wasn't a branding iron or a locked door. It was a piece of paper that claimed I belonged to somebody else, and I didn't have the knowledge to understand it was lying to me." She wrote a single word on the chalkboard, large enough for everyone in the room to see clearly. "Krites. Every one of you is going to leave this schoolhouse knowing how to read a contract, understand a deed. Recognize when somebody's trying to trick you with fine print and legal language designed to confuse you," she said, "because knowledge is the one thing nobody can brand out of you. Nobody can lock it away. Once you have it, it's yours, same as your own name." Outside the window, Gideon leaned against a fence post, watching her teach, the bell still swaying slightly overhead in the spring breeze. Martha came to stand beside him, having ridden out from her boarding house that morning, specifically to see the schoolhouse open its doors for the first time. "She's built something fine here," Martha said. "She has," Gideon agreed. "You planning on sticking around for it?" Gideon watched Evie through the window, chalk dust on her hands, her voice carrying clear and confident to the young women hanging on her every word, and felt something settle in him that had nothing to do with fear or fighting, something steadier than anything he'd known in 15 years of chasing bounties across the territory. "I'm not planning on going anywhere," he said. Martha smiled and left him to it, walking back toward the schoolhouse to see if there was any way she could help with the growing crowd of students still arriving. And Gideon stayed where he was, content to watch, the bell still catching the morning light above the door. That evening, after the last student had gone home, and the schoolhouse sat quiet under the darkening sky, Evie found Gideon still waiting by the fence, exactly where he'd been that morning. "Long day," she said, coming to stand beside him. "Good day, it is that." She looked up at the bell one more time, the bronze catching the last light of the sunset. "I keep thinking about that night at the ranch, the forge, the iron, all 40 of those men standing there, watching like it was nothing more than ordinary business. I think about it too. I used to think the fire that made that brand was the worst thing that ever happened to me," Evie said. "Now I think about the fire that made this bell, and I understand something I didn't back then. The same flame that can be used to hurt somebody can be turned toward something better, if you're willing to do the work of reshaping it." Gideon reached over and took her scarred hand in his, careful and gentle, the same way he had that first night in the storm all those months ago. "True justice," Evie said quietly, "was never just about punishing Jeremiah and Abigail. It was about building something that outlasts them, something that keeps this from happening to the next woman. And the woman after that. You did that," Gideon said. "Whatever else happens from here, you already did that." Evie leaned into him, watching the last light fade from the sky. The bell hanging silent now above the schoolhouse door, but ready, come morning, to ring out again across the plains, calling another group of young women toward the kind of freedom that came not from being rescued, but from learning, finally to stand on their own. And so, as the schoolhouse bell rang across the wide Wyoming plains, it carried more than the sound of a new beginning, carried the voices of every woman who had once been silenced, every frightened soul who had been told that power belonged only to the wealthy, the violent, or the well-connected. Evie Thorne's journey reminds us that true freedom is not simply escaping the person who controls us. Freedom begins when we reclaim the right to make our own choices, speak our own truth, and decide what kind of future we will build. Gideon may have fired the shot that saved Evie from the branding iron, but he could not give her freedom as though it were a gift. That freedom had always belonged to her. What he gave her was the chance to recognize it, protect it, and eventually use it to help others. Their story also teaches us that courage is not the absence of fear. Evie was afraid when she stood before 40 men, when she returned to Blackwood Ranch, and when she reached into the flames to save the evidence. Caleb was afraid when he betrayed a corrupt employer. Martha was afraid when she finally broke 15 years of silence. Even Gideon, the deadliest man among them, was afraid of losing someone he had come to love. Yet each of them chose to act despite that fear. That is what courage truly means. The story also shows us that violence alone cannot destroy injustice. Gideon could have killed Jeremiah in the darkness, but another cruel man might have taken his place. Evie understood that one bullet could punish one man, while truth could expose an entire system. The ledger, the testimony, and the courage of ordinary people brought down something far greater than a single enemy. Justice became possible only when people stopped looking away and stood together. Perhaps the most powerful lesson lies in what Evie did with the branding iron. She did not hide it, and she did not allow it to remain a symbol of shame. She melted it down and transformed it into a bella weapon of oppression, reshaped into a call for knowledge and hope. In doing so, she proved that the things meant to destroy us do not have to define us. Pain can become purpose. Scars can become strength. And the fire once used to hurt us can become the same fire that helps us build something better. Gideon and Evie's love was meaningful because it was not based on ownership, rescue, or obligation. It grew from trust, respect, and freely given choice. He did not ask her to belong to him. He stood beside her while she learned to belong fully to herself. And in the end, that may be the greatest kind of love, the kind that does not imprison, command, or control, but helps another person stand taller. So when life places us before cruelty, corruption, or fear, may we remember Evie Thorne. May we refuse to remain silent, simply because silence feels safer. May we remember that change often begins with one person saying, "This is wrong," and another answering, "You will not stand alone." The Blackwoods believed money, contracts, and fear could make their empire permanent. But no empire built on stolen freedom can survive forever once the truth is brought into the light. And long after their names were forgotten, Evie's bell continued to ring, reminding every person who heard it that no human soul can ever be owned, that knowledge is stronger than fear, and that real justice is not only defeating evil, but building a world where it cannot rise so easily again. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more unforgettable tales from the American frontier, and join us again for another journey into the wild heart of the West. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.